Welcome, Wargamers, to the putrescent waters of the mortal realms as we take a look at a story straight out of the Maggotkin of Nurgle Battletome to explore the Tainted Waters. The river tribes of northern Invidia successfully drive back a host of Nurgle demons from their lands, slaying hundreds in a great battle at the Fork of Minute. Yet so much plague-bearer blood is spilled into the life-giving waters of one of these pristine waterways that they become clogged and putrescent. Unable to drink the tainted liquid or feed upon the rotting, bloated fish within, the Invidian tribes are stricken by terrible thirst and hunger. In desperation, they pray to any gods or higher powers that might listen for rainfall and for sorely needed food. Eroticus, the generous, hears their call. The great unclean one summons a pestilential downpour of ooze that overflows the banks of the Minute River and swamps the tribe's people's lands. It brings with it bountiful diseases, mutations, and other grotesque blessings. Choosing damnation over obliteration, the survivors of the river tribes finally accept these gifts. Thereafter, they refer to themselves as the Grey Deluge. This pious ravager horde travels far and wide extolling the virtues of its savior, and the slaughtering of any who shun the Rainfather's magnanimous offerings. So I like this story. We're going to get into why in a little bit here, but one thing I do want to start off is just talking about the setting. So we don't actually know where this Fork of Minute, I think it's Minuet. I couldn't actually find that on a map. However, it does say clearly that it's in Invidia, which is a location that we actually know from several stories. Invidia comes up as being the staging ground for a lot of Nurgle armies throughout the lore. Most recently, it was in Broken Realms Teclis. That's actually where Mannfred went to go and corrupt the Realm Gate there to kind of feed back into the Shyish Nadir. Now, ultimately, he was stopped, but the fact that he was there, and if you read that section or watch that video that I did covering it, there was 3 fairly large Nurgle armies there on that island. It's also come up numerous times throughout the lore in terms of campaigns and that kind of stuff, as far as like when we're trying to find a place where like Nurgle is really, really impressive, Invidia seems to be a reoccurring location. And so my assumption is this story, the Tainted Waters, it does happen in the Age of Chaos, but it's happening specifically at the time where Invidia is really coming under attack. Now, we don't have as much information about how Nurgle got into the realms as, say, Khorne or Tzeentch, where these big, singular catastrophic events let them in. With Nurgle, it seems to be much more of a slow creep, and I would not be surprised if Invidia was where that creep began. And for that reason, I love this story, because to me, it's like a snapshot of a centuries-long war that's not contained to a battlefield. And this is what I mean, like, we saw the defenders, right? I'm just going to call them the river tribes. That's kind of what the name they give them. They actually won the fight, right? Like, no gods came on their side. Alariel wasn't there. They still won the fight, but the aftermath of that conflict still rages upon them. In so many Black Library novels, like, they kind of work up to a big, final battle between the good guys and the bad guys, and the good guys tend to win. But this is a situation where it's like, when I say it's a snapshot of a centuries-long war, what I mean is, yeah, they won that fight, and I'm sure they all felt really great, but in the grand scheme, it was nothing. It was nothing but a roadblock that led to more misery down the road. And that's where you get to see, like, the full scope of how, like, frankly, messed up and screwed everybody was during the Age of Chaos. Every victory is just one part of a larger defeat. And I like the fact that this story brings up some things that are very practical, right? A lot of these, when it gets into Nurgle, it's like, very intense mutations and all these wild things happening. But the truth is, like, thirst and famine are real issues that have destroyed multiple civilizations in our real world, right? Like, in fact, waterways have been important in Ghyran before. We know that so much of the realm lives and dies by the water flow. A good example of this is in the Realm Gate Wars. There was a great unclean one who basically sat in a river and crapped in it, and he basically corrupted everything downstream. So one of the first acts that they did was getting rid of him. Because they have an ecosystem where everything is connected, much like we do, and so adding a corrupting presence to that is absolutely devastating. It affects everything downriver and then like further down in your ecosystem chain. And while we often talk about why, societies would fall to chaos, there's a precious few stories where it actually shows people like before and after they became chaos warriors or their tribe fell to chaos or whatever. But I love these like very practical ones that are easy to conceive of, right? We won the fight. Alariel didn't help us. It was all us. And when the aftermath of that victory left us starving and thirsty, we became desperate. And you know who helped? Not Alariel. And I can see that kernel of spite like manifesting in them. The fact that it isn't a second army of demons that comes and turns them, it's not, again, another big momentous battle, but an actual granting of their wishes makes Nurgle more palatable. Of course, they chose a corrupt god who listens over a pure goddess who remained silent, which is a decision that makes more sense as you look at your starving, and thirsty children and the rest of your tribe and that kind of stuff. And so at times like these, I look at this story and I'm like, that's actually makes perfect sense. I mean, if you can't beat them, join them. I mean, once you are already at the point of desperation with food and water, and like the only thing that happens is it starts raining slop and ooze, like what do you do? How do you fight against that? There's no way. And I kind of like that because they fought and won against the army of Nurgle, but they didn't win against like the power of Nurgle, right? The power of Nurgle is all about despair and sadness and kind of forlorn hope, that kind of stuff. They couldn't beat that. They could just beat, plague bearers all day with swords, but they couldn't beat despair. And that's a really interesting take. And that's why, fundamentally, this is a warband, the Grey Deluge, that was formed essentially from despair rather than necessarily a conquering army who subjugated them and intentionally tortured and twisted them into something chaotic. They just birthed that way because they just reached a point where there was nothing else to do. And on top of that, it features one of my favorite characters, which is Eroticus. Now, we've talked about him before, but one of the things that is unique about Eroticus, and obviously is very relevant to the story, is that he has a big ears, right? He's always listening for prayers. In this story, they go pretty much and spell out the fact that they're praying to any god, any higher power who will listen. And the thing is, when you call out into the void, you never know who's listening and who's going to answer. Because Eroticus is all too happy to deliver rain to barren fields and dry rivers, bountiful foods and, plants that pollinate and burst with life. Of course, to him, it's an actual flood of life. To us, it's a horrific downpour of disease and pestilence and slop. But it's a concept that not a lot of other characters even wade into. The idea of how many other characters do we know of that actively listen to the prayers of mortals who are not deities, right? Like, Eroticus isn't. He just is a really good listener, and he provides what you're asking for, as long as what you're asking for is something that he can do in a really Nurgle-y way. And so for that reason, I think he's a fantastic character. Like, it's just, that's his unique shtick to me, right? People can talk about how his unique thing is that he, does a lot of stuff with rain and he loves having big hordes of demons. It's like, no, his unique selling point is that he actively, as an emissary of Nurgle, goes out, listens to prayers, and delivers. And he delivers in the most miserable way, because if your prayer gets answered and it's not what you want and it was your last hope, you're broken, right? That despair that we mentioned before becomes overwhelming and crushing, which is such a weird weapon to think about, but it really truly is. And that's really why I like Nurgle quite a bit, is just weaponized sadness or despair. There's something about that, and Eroticus is the true embodiment of it, because he's answering your prayers in a way that fills you with absolute despair. Now, these warriors go on to become the Grey Deluge. Not my favorite name. Personally, if I was going to name these guys, I would have gone with something probably about provision, like how, Eroticus provided rain and sustenance for them. I mean, essentially, at the end of the story, they're going out like proselytizing, like, hey, everyone should love Nurgle because he's our savior. He answered our prayers about water and we're all good now, that kind of stuff. I mean, obviously, they look like bloated, nasty zombies, but, I feel like that would be a better name as opposed to Grey Deluge, which just kind of sounds like, I don't know, runoff water from a gutter. But I have a few more points that I want to talk about as to why I find this so interesting, and we're going to cover those right after a quick word from today's sponsor. All right, friends, game time. Can you tell me what all 4 of these things have in common? That's right, they are all traps, but not the kind of traps that you would likely find within your role-playing game dungeons. But if you would like to increase the danger level of your dungeons, castles, and ruins with an extra hint of spice, check out the Treacherous Traps supplement by Nord Games, a massive compendium that works for any role-playing game system and injects danger into any corridor or chest. Now, this is a massive resource for any aspiring DMs who want to be able to create compelling and interesting games, puzzles, and pitfalls for your players in a wide variety of settings. It's full of fun artwork and helpful tips, and they even have these cool little random card generator things so you can generate a trap on the fly if you're not quite sure how you want to torture your friends and family that particular day. No judgment. So add some fun and excitement to your next campaign by setting some treacherous traps of your own through the link in the description down below. Now, back to the show. Alright friends, so why is this story so cool? What about the tainted waters back in the Age of Chaos is so awesome? Well, to me, it does a great job of demonstrating what makes Nurgle so powerful, right? That he's not just a leader of an army, but he is a true infection upon the realms. And I've said this before in other stories, and I point it out whenever it comes, because it doesn't come out enough in my opinion, but so whenever I see it, I want to highlight it. If you were to put all, 4 to 5, if you count the Great Horned Rat, Chaos Gods in one area and say, conquer everything, you're going to have some different ways to go about it, okay? Like, the most direct and straightforward is going to be Khorne. He's going to build armies, he's going to go, and he's going to just conquer, right? He's going to go from place to place to place, smashing everything in his way. Tzeentch is largely going to do something very similar. The Great Horned Rat, he's going to do whatever he's going to do. He's got a whole, under Empire thing. And Slaanesh, they tend to do something very similar. Rush out and just go conquer things, have big fights, lots of thrills, all that stuff. But with Nurgle, he brings something different to the table, and stories like this actively make it clear to us. Because the nature of disease and infection and spreading and that kind of stuff, contagion as a weapon, is so different than an actual boots to the ground army. Nurgle can have an army in one location, but as long as that location is upstream, it can reasonably corrupt just about anything downstream, which allows him to project his danger and his power and his influence far further than a marching army ever could. And it works both ways. Not only does he project his threat much further by corrupting everything around them, but also, let's say the defenders try to take back land. If you take back land from Khorne, it's just a crumpled old fort. You can just, reconstitute it, rebuild it, whatever you want to do. But taking back land from Nurgle is so much more difficult because he changes the ecosystem. The entire environment is all in a whack. It takes a lot of time for the actual realms to heal. He has a unique weapon that is just his presence. And I never thought that was highlighted enough. I mean, obviously, for the purposes of, a war game, they also focus on heroes a lot and the deeds of the putrid Blight Kings and that kind of stuff. But when you really read about how he's been able to take over such large quantities of Buran, a lot of it has very little to do with boots on the ground. It's just the projection of this disease and plague that is corrupting everything as it touches it. Which, to be honest, I think makes his military campaigns far more interesting. Having that kind of ability to project disease and that kind of stuff so far away, it just makes me think that, Khorne would target major settlements or strongholds or fortifications, something like that. But Nurgle, if he just targets all of the rivers or the rivers, ponds, ocean beds, that kind of stuff, and just corrupts them, everything downstream gets messed up, and so they can just come and just knock off whatever defenders are left. And for that reason, I absolutely love any story that features Nurgle using disease and blight and contagions as weapons without a whole lot of focus on warriors per se. But another great thing about this story is it just really showcases why people fall to chaos. And that, honestly, when it comes to Nurgle specifically, I always kind of think that that's the hard part. I can understand someone looking at a really ripped Khorne warrior who's just super badass and he's got an awesome axe in his hand. You'd be I want to be like that guy, right? He might be evil and do evil things, but you can look at his cool armor and his neat trim and be like, that guy is cool, I want to be that. How do you look at a Blight King and you're yeah, buddy? It's just a very specific person who can look at the body of a Blight King and be I'm on board, sign me up. At least compared to the others. With Slaanesh, you got a lithe body. Tzeentch, you probably have some mutations, but you generally look very cool. maybe lots of colors on you. But Blight Kings are like, you're fat and dumpy, but you're also the best. But this is a great example of how people fall to the powers of chaos, specifically Nurgle, of course, without soldiers having to be there. They don't have to like look at a chaos warrior of Nurgle and be like, looks like you've got it all figured out, buddy. Sign me up, right? It's more these environmental circumstances that push them towards a terrible decision. A Pyrrhic victory where they beat the forces of Nurgle on their own, but in doing so, corrupt everything around them. The fact that Alarielle is not answering in her own realm. I'm not sure, this doesn't really give us a good point of reference about like where she is. Like maybe she's out fighting. She could already be like in her, winter aspect, all kind of depressed in her little hidden realm. We don't know, but I understand the desperation to survive and then just the feeling of absolute hopelessness when, it starts to rain, but the rain is just poison. I get it. I get how it can break people and what it can do to folks. So for that reason, like I think this is a perfect story to showcase when it comes to why would anyone fall to Nurgle, especially like whole people groups rather than individuals. This is a fantastic story to illustrate that. So friends, let me know your thoughts on the Tainted Waters. If you have a better name for this warband than the Grey Deluge, leave in the comments down below. I'll pin the best one to the top. And thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming.